Welcome to HOA Karen Files, where the so-called protectors of order are often the ones who destroy lives. Can you believe that one person's obsession with flower beds can turn an entire neighborhood into a war zone? What you're about to hear isn't just about an old man and his petty squabbles with his neighbors. This is the story of a battle against a hidden system of control you never saw coming. One man fought not just to protect his home, but to tear down every limit of power that tried to control him. If you're tired of people who think they can meddle in your life without consequence, subscribe to HOA Karen Files for more intense stories like this every week. Now, let's dive into how a seemingly peaceful neighborhood turned into a battlefield when one old man decided he'd had enough of the HOA's reign. In a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything looks picture perfect, lush green lawns, houses so pristine they could belong on a postcard, and streetlights that flicker on just in time for dusk, it's easy to forget that not everything is as peaceful as it seems. That is, until one fateful night, when a woman named Brenda Latch decided to change everything. It was midnight, and while the rest of the neighborhood was asleep, Brenda, head of the HOA patrol committee, was sneaking around our backyard. She wasn't knocking on doors. She wasn't asking for permission. No. Instead, she was scaling our 6-foot fence in what can only be described as a bizarre, middle-of-the-night mission. With a flashlight in one hand and what looked like night vision goggles on, she jumped over, landing with the grace of a clumsy ninja into our petunia patch. Now, I wasn't exactly shocked to see her there. I mean, in Grudgewood Lane, the HOA was practically running the show. But this was different. This wasn't just about a neighbor trying to tell us where to plant flowers or what color to paint our fence. This was something personal. I was sitting in the kitchen, eating cold pizza when I saw her, a figure, awkwardly scaling our fence like a parkour enthusiast with osteoporosis, stumbling and landing with a loud thud. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't a trespasser looking to steal. It was Brenda, the woman who had made it her mission to enforce the rules of Grudgewood Lane down to the most ridiculous detail. The next morning, Grandpa wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was just preparing. He rewired the entire fence. And when I asked him why, all he said was, if they want to play dirty, we'll give them a little jolt of justice. Grudgewood Lane, a name that, to most, invoked thoughts of picture-perfect homes, manicured lawns, and quiet suburban evenings. It was a place where the grass was always trimmed, where fences were never more than 2 inches off level, and where every house looked like it had just been painted by an army of meticulous perfectionists. It was the kind of neighborhood where the only sign of rebellion was when someone dared to put up a wind chime that didn't match the approved shade of turquoise. Or, worse, let a lawn ornament lean too far to the left. And, in this world, that was a violation of the highest order. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, controlled it all, everything. The color of the shutters, the height of the grass, the precise angle at which your driveway had to be swept. There was no room for individuality, no space for creativity. In this world, perfection wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. For some, that meant living in a constant state of paranoia. Waking up in the middle of the night, checking the mailbox to ensure it hadn't shifted a millimeter out of place. Others would simply ignore the rules, knowing the HOA's rules would catch up with them sooner or later. But for Grandpa Joe, a man who had spent his life fighting for personal freedom and against any form of tyranny, this sort of suburban dictatorship was something he simply could not stand. Grandpa wasn't the kind of man who just tolerated being told what to do. He was the kind of man who built his life on the principle that no one, not even the most powerful community organization, had the right to control his home and his life. And that was the precise moment that Grudgewood Lane went from being a quiet, predictable neighborhood to a battleground of petty disputes, shocking confrontations, and legal chaos. It started small, an innocuous violation, one that on the surface seemed laughable, but that was the spark that set everything into motion. The first violation. It was Grandpa's windmill, a simple, handcrafted windmill that he placed in the backyard. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't some gaudy piece of art. It was just a symbol of Grandpa's past, a connection to his youth, a reminder of his time growing up on a farm where windmills dotted the landscape. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore. They sent the first warning, stating that the windmill did not fit the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. Grandpa, not one to back down, refused to take it down. "It's my property," he said. "They have no say over what I put in my backyard." But this was only the beginning. Next came the shed. Grandpa had painted his shed red, a bold, vibrant red, the color of life and passion. To him, it wasn't just a shed, it was a statement. It said, "I am alive, I am here, and I will not be hidden behind bland, neutral tones." But the HOA didn't see it that way. They issued a fine. The shed was an unauthorized color, they said, and needed to be repainted. It had to be a shade of beige that blended into the landscape. The absurdity of it was enough to make anyone laugh. But Grandpa didn't laugh. He fought back, even though he knew the battle was far from over. But it wasn't just about the shed or the windmill. It was about control. And the HOA wanted control over everything. The HOA's tightening grip. The HOA's influence began to grow with every passing week. Brenda Latch, the head of the HOA patrol, took it upon herself to monitor the neighborhood like a hawk. She became obsessed with enforcing rules. She walked around the streets with her clipboard, checking for any violations. She even began making surprise visits, knocking on doors with little regard for personal privacy. People were scared of her, but Grandpa didn't care. The first time Grandpa encountered Brenda face to face, it wasn't pretty. It happened at a community meeting. The HOA was discussing the future of the neighborhood and its aesthetic integrity. Grandpa had brought donuts because, well, what better way to handle a bureaucratic nightmare than with a few sugar-filled pastries? As the meeting progressed, Brenda began to speak about how the neighborhood's image needed to be upheld. It was clear that she thought she had absolute power. Grandpa, without hesitation, stood up in the middle of the meeting, donut in hand, and yelled, "This is a bunch of nonsense. You're all a bunch of self-important fascists." The room fell silent. He wasn't done. "Communist," he shouted at Brenda. "And don't even think about telling me what color my shed should be." With that, Grandpa stormed out of the meeting, leaving a trail of donut crumbs in his wake. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of war against the HOA. But for Grandpa, it was just the beginning. The hose incident. The real tipping point came when we were fined for a garden hose. Yes, you heard that right. A hose. It wasn't even ours. It belonged to the Johnsons next door. It had their initials on it, clearly marked, but the HOA didn't care. They fined us $50 for leaving a garden hose out overnight. It was absurd. But it wasn't about the hose. It was about control. Grandpa's blood boiled when he received the fine. This wasn't just petty. It was personal. They were telling him how to live, how to maintain his own property. That's when Grandpa decided that enough was enough. He installed cameras around our house, not because he was paranoid, but because he knew something was coming. He knew that Brenda was watching, waiting for any excuse to fine us again. What Grandpa didn't expect, however, was what the cameras would capture that night. The night Brenda came. The footage was chilling. There was Brenda creeping around our backyard, flashlight in hand, sneaking through the flower beds, inspecting our garden anew like it was a piece of contraband. At one point, she even went through our recycling bin, searching for something, anything. It was clear that she had crossed a line. Grandpa watched the footage in silence, his face growing darker with each passing second. He didn't say a word. He just watched. Then, finally, he spoke. "War has rules." "This isn't war," he muttered to himself. That was the moment when Grandpa decided that he wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to fight dirty. Operation Sparky Perimeter. Grandpa didn't waste any time. In the garage, armed with a truck battery, copper wire, and more duct tape than anyone should ever own, he began working. It was a strange, almost comical sight. An elderly man, hunched over a workbench, soldering wires together, mumbling to himself about justice and the rules. And then, just like that, Grandpa electrified the fence. It wasn't enough to kill, of course, just enough to send a message. a shock that would make anyone think twice before trespassing again. He called it Operation Sparky Perimeter. When he was done, he attached a wooden sign to the fence that read, "Trespassers will be shocked." Literally, it was a declaration of war, a challenge to Brenda and anyone else in the HOA who thought they could control his life. The first night. We waited. The first night. Nothing happened. It was quiet. Too quiet. Grandpa sat in his rocking chair, eyes fixed on the fence, a glint of defiance in his eyes. But on the second night, we heard it, a high-pitched scream, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone hitting the ground. We rushed outside, only to find Brenda lying on the ground, twitching like she'd just kissed an electric eel. She was dazed, disoriented, her wig askew, and the faint smell of burnt polyester filling the air. She was fine, mostly, just a little shaken up, but it was enough. Enough to send the message. Brenda didn't take it well. She threatened to sue us, shouting about being assaulted by a geriatric delinquent. But as she limped away, clutching her phone, the neighborhood was already abuzz. The HOA was furious, but Grandpa was smirking, and that's when the real war began. After the night, Brenda was shocked. The peaceful suburban life on Grudgewood Lane was no more. What had once been a quiet, well-manicured neighborhood, where every neighbor kept to themselves and the HOA's reign seemed absolute, was now at the heart of something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. The following morning, the entire neighborhood was abuzz. Word had spread like wildfire. Brenda Latch had been shocked. And while no one dared to say it out loud, there was an undeniable sense of exhilaration in the air. People didn't know if they should be outraged, amused, or both. But one thing was clear. Grandpa Joe had struck a nerve. Brenda, on the other hand, was less than thrilled. She was furious. She limped around, with her neck brace and an air of martyrdom, acting as if she had just survived a war zone. But the truth was, she had only received a mild electric shock, and anyone with common sense knew that. Still, she was determined to paint herself as the victim, an innocent victim of an elderly vigilante. The HOA's response. It didn't take long for the HOA to react. They had no choice. Their image, their very control over Grudgewood Lane, was in jeopardy. Brenda was their enforcer. She was their face. And if she couldn't hold the line, then who could? The HOA's first move was swift. They issued a formal complaint against Grandpa. The letter they sent was thick, legal, and filled with all the typical phrases: reckless endangerment, intentional harm, and malicious intent. It demanded that Grandpa pay a hefty fine, dismantle the electric fence, and issue an apology to Brenda. It was a legal document that reeked of power, of control. But Grandpa wasn't intimidated, not by a long shot. He framed the complaint and hung it proudly above the fireplace, a trophy from the war he had started. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It had become personal. The HOA wasn't just fighting to preserve their rules. They were fighting to destroy the very spirit of rebellion that Grandpa had ignited in Grudgewood Lane. But the HOA wasn't done. They sent a formal warning, telling Grandpa that if he didn't comply, they would escalate the matter. They had the power to make things very difficult for him. But Grandpa wasn't concerned. He didn't fear their threats. He simply looked at the letter, read it aloud for effect, and then tossed it into the recycling bin with a shrug. But the HOA's threats didn't end there. They had a bigger plan, one that they believed would finally bring Grandpa to heel. The lawsuit. 1 week later, Brenda's lawyer arrived on our doorstep, a man in his 40s, sharp-suited, with a briefcase that probably weighed more than he did. He introduced himself as Harold Grant, an attorney with years of experience in property law. His mission was simple: to extract as much money from Grandpa as possible, to make him pay for his defiance. The lawsuit was no surprise. We all knew it was coming. But what struck me was the way Harold spoke, so cold, so confident. He had been hired not only to defend Brenda's honor, but to make an example of Grandpa, to make sure that no one in Grudgewood Lane would ever dare to challenge the HOA again. "You can settle this now, Mr. Reynolds," Harold said, his voice as smooth as oil. "Or we can take this to court, but I assure you, the HOA doesn't lose." Grandpa didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a knowing grin that I knew all too well. He wasn't afraid of a legal battle. In fact, he was looking forward to it. "We'll see," Grandpa said, "but I'm not backing down." The community divided. As the lawsuit began to make its way through the legal system, the community began to split. Some neighbors sided with the HOA, fearful of the consequences of Grandpa's actions. They didn't want to see the neighborhood descend into chaos. They feared the HOA's power and the possible repercussions of defying it. But there were others who saw what Grandpa had done differently. They saw him not as a villain, but as a symbol of defiance. A man who had stood up to an overbearing system that treated them all like prisoners in their own homes. These were the people who began to rally behind Grandpa. They sent fruit baskets. They brought him pies. They came to visit him just to offer support. Grandpa had become a hero to some, a symbol of resistance to others. The counterattack. Grandpa knew that if he was going to win, he needed more than just his stubbornness. He needed evidence. He needed proof that the HOA was violating people's rights, that they were abusing their power, that they were infringing on personal freedoms. So, he enlisted the help of Sanjay Patel, a local lawyer who had dealt with the HOA's nonsense before. Sanjay, like Grandpa, was fed up. He had 3 HOA violations himself, one for an unauthorized bonsai tree, one for his inconsistent fence color, and one for his unapproved decorative rocks. You see, he wasn't intimidated by the HOA's threats. In fact, he had been waiting for someone to take a stand. Together, Grandpa and Sanjay dug into the HOA's actions. They started collecting evidence. They started interviewing neighbors, getting footage from doorbell cameras, and compiling stories of harassment. What they found was nothing short of shocking. The HOA had been conducting secret inspections of people's properties without proper notice. They had been spying on their neighbors, keeping a log of violations they had manufactured just to issue fines. They had become the very thing they had claimed to protect against an invasive, overbearing bureaucracy that cared more about control than community. The legal battle begins. The legal battle that ensued was long, drawn out, and full of tension. The HOA, with all its power and resources, fought tooth and nail to crush Grandpa and his supporters. They hired top-tier lawyers. They dug into Grandpa's past, and they tried to discredit him at every turn. But Grandpa wasn't going to back down. He fought with every ounce of his being. He didn't just fight for himself. He fought for every person in Grudgewood Lane who had ever felt the sting of the HOA's overreach. He fought for every neighbor who had ever received a fine for something trivial, for every family that had been bullied into submission by the HOA's intimidating power. The fallout. As the case dragged on, the neighborhood began to change. People who had once been silent began to speak out. They began to ask questions. They began to wonder if the HOA's iron grip on their lives was really necessary. And some even began to question the HOA's motives. Brenda, who had once been the face of the HOA's power, became a pariah. She was seen as a symbol of everything that was wrong with Grudgewood Lane. People started distancing themselves from her, refusing to answer her calls, avoiding her at all costs. Meanwhile, Grandpa's popularity grew. He was becoming something of a local legend. People started calling him Shock Grandpa in jest, and children would come to his house, knocking on his door just to get his advice on how to deal with the HOA. Grandpa, always the humble man, would offer them a donut and a smile, never turning anyone away. But as the neighborhood rallied around him, the HOA grew more desperate. They knew they couldn't lose. They couldn't let Grandpa set a precedent. If they did, then Grudgewood Lane would never be the same. They couldn't allow the spirit of rebellion to spread. And so, they fought harder. By the time the court case had started, Grudgewood Lane had already been transformed. What had once been a sleepy, uniform neighborhood where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened was now a battlefield. A cold war was being waged between Grandpa Joe and the HOA, and every little action felt like it could tip the balance. The HOA had underestimated Grandpa from the start. They thought he was just a grumpy old man with too much time on his hands, someone who'd give in as soon as they threw a few legal threats his way. But they were wrong. Grandpa Joe wasn't just any man. He was a man of principle, and he had no intention of letting the HOA dictate his life or the lives of the people in Grudgewood Lane. Grandpa's lawyer, Sanjay Patel, had quickly become the mastermind behind their legal defense. Sanjay wasn't just good at his job. He was passionate about fighting back against the HOA, and he knew they could win. They had something the HOA didn't: the truth. And in a legal battle, the truth, no matter how ugly it might be, was a powerful weapon. But as the days passed and the case inched closer to trial, the tension in the neighborhood continued to build. People were starting to take sides, and for the first time in years, the quiet, as controlled streets of Grudgewood Lane were alive with whispers, gossip, and defiance. The neighborhood divided. At first, it was just a few people, the ones who had always seen the HOA for what it truly was: an overbearing, power-hungry institution that thrived on control. These people rallied behind Grandpa, bringing him gifts, offering support, and spreading the word about the injustice of it all. They saw him as a symbol of resistance, the one person who had the courage to fight back. But as the case progressed, more and more people began to voice their opinions. Some supported Grandpa outright. They believed he had done what needed to be done. He wasn't just defending himself. He was defending their right to live freely, without the oppressive watch of the HOA over their every move. Others, however, began to waver. They didn't want to be dragged into a legal war. They didn't want their names associated with a lawsuit that could drag on for years. They feared the consequences of defying the HOA, and so they chose to stay silent. They didn't want to risk the fines, the legal battles, or the chaos that had come to define Grandpa's fight. And then there were those who sided with the HOA. They were the ones who had always lived in fear of the HOA's power, who had never questioned its authority, and who believed that Grandpa's defiance was a direct threat to the peace and stability of their neighborhood. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was a troublemaker, a rebel who had disrupted the fragile order they had worked so hard to maintain. The battle in court. As the case reached its crescendo, it became clear that this was no longer just a simple dispute between neighbors. This was a legal war. Grandpa and Sanjay had filed a counterclaim against the HOA, accusing them of harassment, abuse of power, and illegal surveillance. They presented evidence, recordings from security cameras, testimonies from neighbors, and even footage of Brenda herself sneaking around the neighborhood under the guise of inspections. The evidence was damning. Brenda, the HOA's top enforcer, had been caught multiple times trespassing on private property, entering homes without permission, and making judgment calls on things that had no business being any of her concern. The HOA's claim to moral authority began to crumble under the weight of their own actions. But the HOA wasn't about to give up without a fight. They had deep pockets and the best lawyers money could buy. They went on the offensive, trying to discredit Grandpa and Sanjay at every turn. They painted Grandpa as a dangerous, delusional old man, someone who had lost touch with reality and couldn't control his temper. They even tried to dig up anything they could from Grandpa's past, hoping to find something, anything, that would discredit him in the eyes of the judge. Grandpa's response: he laughed. He wasn't scared. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. His focus remained on one thing and one thing only: to ensure that the HOA's abuses would be exposed for the world to see: the media frenzy. As the court case gained more attention, the media caught wind of the story. Local news outlets began covering the trial, and soon it became the talk of the town. The story of the old man who shocked the HOA was too good to pass up. It was sensational, dramatic, and packed with enough conflict to keep viewers coming back for more. Some news outlets portrayed Grandpa as a local hero, a man who had stood up against a corrupt system that had gone unchecked for far too long. Others painted him as a villain, a rogue agent who had taken the law into his own hands and threatened the fragile peace of suburban life. But no matter how the media framed the story, one thing was undeniable. The war between Grandpa and the HOA had captured the community's imagination. It had exposed the dark side of suburban life and forced people to ask tough questions about the price of conformity and control. The first major victory. It wasn't long before Grandpa and Sanjay scored their first major victory. The judge overseeing the case ruled that the HOA's actions had been illegal. They had violated multiple rights of the residents, including illegal surveillance and harassment. The ruling was a huge blow to the HOA, and it sent shockwaves through the community. But the battle wasn't over. The HOA had the resources to appeal, and they immediately began working to overturn the decision. They weren't going to lose this fight, not without a fight of their own. The legal battle was far from over, and Grandpa knew it. But for the first time in months, he allowed himself a small victory. As the ruling was handed down, Grandpa stood in the courtroom, his chest puffed with pride. It wasn't just about the victory, it was about the principle of it all. The HOA had underestimated him, and now they had to face the consequences. After the judge's ruling, the mood in Grudgewood Lane shifted. The weight of what had happened hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Grandpa Joe, the once quiet man who had spent his days reading books and tinkering in his garage, had become the unexpected hero of the neighborhood. And though many had sided with him, others still feared the consequences of defying the HOA. But the victory in court was just the beginning. The HOA wasn't about to lose its grip on the neighborhood without one last, desperate push. They weren't going to let an old man, no matter how brave or stubborn, destroy their carefully crafted empire of rules and control. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about survival. The HOA's counterattack. It didn't take long for the HOA to react. Behind closed doors, the committee met, and a decision was made. They weren't going to take this lying down. If Grandpa Joe had exposed their secrets in court, then they would make sure he paid for it. The HOA had the money, the lawyers, and the resources. Grandpa had the truth, but what good was the truth if it couldn't stop an avalanche? The HOA filed an appeal. The ruling was challenged, but it was more than that. They decided to go after Grandpa in ways no one had expected. They filed new complaints, accusing him of further violations, all of which were fabricated. They even took things a step further, claiming that Grandpa had caused unrest in the neighborhood and was disrupting the community's peace. They hired new lawyers, this time with a reputation for being ruthless. The battle was escalating, and both sides were digging in their heels. But Grandpa wasn't afraid. He wasn't scared of the HOA's power. He had faced worse in his lifetime. He had fought in wars, stood up to bullies, and refused to bow down to anyone who tried to control his life. The HOA was just another challenge, the sabotage. Then, just as things seemed like they might calm down, something happened. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. Grandpa woke up one morning to find that the wiring around his electrified fence had been cut. Not just a minor malfunction, the wires had been completely sabotaged. It was an act of vengeance, and everyone knew it. Someone had crossed a line. The sabotage wasn't just a physical attack on Grandpa's property. It was a direct challenge to his defiance. The HOA had sent a message, "We're not done with you yet." Grandpa stood there for a long time, staring at the wreckage of his fence. His face was unreadable, but there was a fire in his eyes. He wasn't about to let anyone get away with this. He knew the fight wasn't just about property lines or neighborhood rules anymore. It was about the very essence of what the neighborhood stood for: freedom, individuality, the right to live without fear of constant surveillance. He wasn't backing down. The neighbor's betrayal. Grandpa wasn't the only one who noticed the sabotage. The rest of the neighborhood did too. Whispers spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the tension reached its peak. Then, to Grandpa's shock, one of the neighbors came forward. Mr. Reynolds, a man who had always kept to himself, stepped up and admitted to something that left everyone stunned. He had been the one who sabotaged the fence. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Mr. Reynolds said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I just didn't want things to get out of hand. I thought I was doing what was right. The HOA promised me peace, but now it's a mess." It was a betrayal, and Grandpa felt the sting of it. Mr. Reynolds had been a silent supporter, someone who had admired Grandpa's courage from afar. But when push came to shove, he had chosen to appease the HOA. He had believed the lies, feared the consequences, And in the process, he had turned his back on Grandpa. But Grandpa, in his quiet wisdom, understood. Fear had a way of making people do things they didn't want to do. And Mr. Reynolds was no different. Grandpa didn't get angry. He didn't shout. Instead, he simply looked Mr. Reynolds in the eye and said, "I get it, but you can't hide from the truth forever. You'll see it for yourself." The counterstrike Grandpa wasn't going to let the sabotage go unanswered. With the help of Sanjay, Grandpa began to take action. They collected evidence. They filed new complaints with the city, accusing the HOA of conspiracy and sabotage. They went public. They hired a media team and started to spread the word. Grandpa was no longer just a man fighting for his right to live freely. He had become a symbol of defiance against an oppressive system that had been suffocating the neighborhood for years. They made sure every neighbor knew the truth about the HOA's illegal tactics. They told stories of how the HOA had watched them, followed them, measured their lawns, and fined them for the most ridiculous reasons. They spread the word about the illegal surveillance cameras the HOA had planted around Grudgewood Lane, and as the truth began to seep into the community, things started to change. People began to see the HOA for what it truly was, a corporate entity that had lost sight of its original purpose, an organization that had lost its way. The tide was turning. The final showdown. The final confrontation came when Grandpa and Sanjay went to court for the last time. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It wasn't just about the petty violations or the fines. It was about justice. It was about proving that one person, one act of rebellion, could stand up against the tide of conformity. The court session was long. The attorneys fought tooth and nail. But in the end, the judge ruled in Grandpa's favor once again. The HOA was ordered to pay a significant fine, and the judge made it clear that their actions had been illegal from the start. The ruling was a decisive blow, not just for the HOA, but for every resident who had ever felt oppressed by their authority. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was a turning point. The HOA's power was broken, and with it, the illusion of their unshakable authority. The aftermath. As the days passed, Grudgewood Lane began to change. People began to put up wind chimes. They painted their fences different colors. They started to live their lives with a sense of freedom they hadn't felt in years. The HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood had loosened, and now the people had their power back. Grandpa, for all his stubbornness and defiance, had not only fought for his own freedom, but for the freedom of everyone around him. The neighborhood was different now. It was alive, vibrant, and full of life. As for Grandpa, he stood on his porch, looking out at the changes in his neighborhood, a smile creeping onto his face. He had won, and more than that, he had reminded everyone in Grudgewood Lane that, sometimes, all it takes to change the world is one person willing to stand up and say, "Enough." It's said that the loudest battles are often fought in silence. But when the dust finally settled on Grudgewood Lane, the world had shifted. The HOA, the once mighty force that had ruled over the neighborhood with iron fists and rigid rules, was now a shell of its former self. And Grandpa Joe, the man who had once seemed like just another cantankerous old man, had become something far greater, a symbol of resistance, of standing up against tyranny, and of reclaiming freedom. The victory in the courtroom had been hard won, but it was not the end. No, not by a long shot. Grandpa had fought the battle, but the war for Grudgewood Lane's soul was only just beginning. The aftermath. The immediate aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind. News crews flocked to the neighborhood. Reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers filled the streets. Some came to hear Grandpa's side of the story, while others were just there for the spectacle. The once quiet cul-de-sac was now a center of attention, and for the first time in years, the residents of Grudgewood Lane felt like they had a voice. The HOA, now reeling from the court's ruling, attempted to maintain some semblance of control. They sent out official emails, held emergency meetings, and even tried to rally some of the residents who still believed in their cause. But the grip the HOA had once had on the neighborhood was slipping, and the people they had had enough. Neighbors who had once been terrified of speaking out were now vocal. They started painting their fences in colors they had always dreamed of, putting up decorations that didn't conform to the HOA's standards, and even holding their own informal meetings. Some of them called Grandpa to thank him. Others sent him fruit baskets or pies. The rebellion, as small as it was, had sparked a fire, but change, as it always does, came at a cost. The cost of freedom. For Grandpa, victory didn't come without its own price. Though the court had ruled in his favor, the battle was far from over. The HOA, in its desperation, began targeting other residents who had shown support for Grandpa. They issued fines for minor infractions that had been overlooked for years. They ramped up their surveillance, monitoring every corner of the neighborhood with the same unyielding eye they had used against Grandpa. And yet, despite it all, something had changed. People were no longer afraid. They were angry, yes, but they were also emboldened. They didn't want to live under the thumb of a bureaucracy that had taken away their right to live freely. Grandpa, for his part, continued to live as he always had. He didn't let the fines or the threats stop him. He spent his days tinkering in his garage, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, and occasionally offering advice to his neighbors who came to him for help. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to be himself. But not everyone felt that way. Some of the residents, particularly those who had been staunch supporters of the HOA, began to grow disillusioned. They had seen the neighborhood unravel in ways they hadn't anticipated. The once pristine lawns, the carefully curated facades, the quiet streets, things were changing. And for some, it was too much, too fast. The new HOA, in the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent a massive transformation. No longer was it the monolithic, unyielding entity it had once been. A new president was elected, and several of the old guard who had been too close to Brenda stepped down. There was talk of restructuring, of scaling back the regulations, of allowing more freedom for the residents. Some even called it a revolution within the revolution. But while the HOA tried to adapt, not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. Brenda, humiliated by her defeat, disappeared from public view. Rumors spread that she had moved away, though no one knew for sure. The damage had been done, and the damage to the HOA's reputation was irreparable. Their grip on the neighborhood had shattered, and no amount of restructuring would ever restore it to its former state. In its place, a new sense of community began to emerge, one where neighbors worked together, where differences were celebrated, and where personal freedom was valued above conformity. The neighborhood transformed. Grudgewood Lane, once a place of sterile perfection, was now alive with individuality. Houses were painted in colors that had never been seen before. Yards that were once the epitome of suburban uniformity were now filled with vibrant flowers, quirky decorations, and even a few illegal wind chimes hanging in defiance of the old rules. People began to host block parties, inviting everyone to come together and celebrate their newfound freedom. Music played in the streets, children ran through sprinklers, and the community that had once been divided by fear now found common ground in their shared experiences. It was a place where, for the first time in a long while, people actually knew each other. They weren't just neighbors. They were a community. And through it all, Grandpa stood as a quiet witness to the change. He didn't seek attention. He didn't want to be called a hero. But the truth was undeniable. His actions had changed everything. One evening, as Grandpa sat on his front porch, looking out over the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect, I asked him a simple question. "Are you happy, Grandpa?" He looked at me, his face softening for just a moment. "I'm not happy," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But I'm satisfied." He paused, looking out over the street, the laughter of children echoing in the background. "Sometimes," he continued, "you have to stir things up to make them better." The final twist. As the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm, there was one last surprise waiting for Grandpa. Late one night, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the new HOA president, someone who had been part of the original revolt. The letter was short, but to the point. "We're sorry. The HOA has been dissolved. The rules are gone. We're free." Grandpa smiled, set the letter down, and stood up. "Guess they finally got the message," he said, walking into the house. He didn't need to say more. We both knew what it meant. For the first time in years, Grudgewood Lane was truly free. And that, folks, is how one man's stand against the overbearing HOA turned his neighborhood upside down. It wasn't just about fences, flower beds, or petty rules. It was about freedom, dignity, and the fight to live life on your own terms. If Grandpa Joe's story has got you thinking about how we all let small things control our lives, maybe it's time we start questioning the rules we follow. Are we going to let these so-called Karens tell us how to live? Or are we ready to fight back? If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another outrageous HOA battle. You don't want to miss what we have coming next on HOA Karen Files. After all, the fight for our rights, big or small, is never over. Thanks for watching. And remember, in the world of HOAs, always be ready for a shock.